What's up? Welcome. As you can see, I am on my own. I am rolling solo dolo for tonight's episode. So we are doing that. I want to give a big shout out to all my homies that couldn't make it today. It's all good. It's all love. They'll be back next week doing what they do best. Steven and Spider will be back next week. Spider's sick. And Steven is working. So a little cranberry juice. Let's run it. So what we're talking about tonight, peeps? We're going to talk about Mount Hermon. Now, Mount Hermon is located in um, the borders of Syria and Israel and a. Let's have a look here. He got to pull stuff up. I should have did this. This is so unprofessional. Such an unprofessional person. Just kidding. Just kidding. So Syria, Lebanon, Israel, all that, all the Middle East area. It rises 9,232 feet and is considered a somewhat cursed but blessed location. It's a very high strangeness thing. A lot of things have happened there in ancient history, supposedly, with some things. But it's a very holy aspect of our Middle Eastern civilizations. So definitely looking forward to talking about this one tonight. Now, it is home to a couple temples, but it also has a ski resort. Could you imagine? Like one of the most kind of cursed mountains, because it's kind of cursed. Like the concept and the aspect of it all is quite cursed. Given the different religious standpoints and aspects and key components of this conversation, I think that what we're seeing here is, I don't know. I'm the type of person I like to I like to get to the bottom of things. I think some of the stuff is really fascinating. I think any biblical archaeology is really interesting. And I feel like Mount Hermon in and of itself is probably one of those places, at least for me, right? Um create something of a interesting concept and conversation. Yeah, there is a UN compound. I don't know if it's so much of a compound, but it's a weather station, if you know what I mean, my friend. Nye, what's up, buddy? How you doing, sir? Let's go. Welcome, welcome, Nye. I appreciate you. Appreciate you. So, Mount Hermon is considered one of like a place of high strangeness. A lot of different things have happened there. They've spotted, anomalies, supposed UFOs, cryptids, things like that near the base of this mountain. Now, in the Judaic and Christian religion beliefs in the book of Enoch, this is the place that the Watchers came down on high from. So when they plan to integrate themselves with human women and sort of put themselves in those situations where they were having that intercourse and creating these Nephilim, the pact that they made, Semyaza, Azazel, Baraquel, all these other fallen or watchers, I should say at the time, because that's what they were known as, the Watchers. They made a pact and they went down into that. And what they did was they assured themselves that this was something that they looked at as being highly important. This was something that, a lot of people didn't quite understand the concept of how this moved, because it was such a place of spiritual awakening for a lot of people, including the Grigori, which were the Watchers of the books of Enoch, the Semyaza, his ilk, Enoch. All of this centers around this pact that was made in on Mount Hermon. I see my buddy is here. Steven is here. Hello, Steven. How are we doing today, buddy?
The angels you were speaking of had some really awesome swords.
Yes, swords, flaming swords, as it were. And welcome everybody. I didn't think Steven was going to be joining us, but I saw him click down there in the group, and I said, let's bring him in. Let's get him in here, and we can have conversations about this together. I'm glad you're here, sir, because Spider's not. He's all sick because whatever. That's what Spider does. He gets sick and then abandons us. How dare
I took a tonic I got from Count Saint Germain, so I'll be
Oh,
fine.
good. You're good. You're good to go. Yeah. You're good to go. So what do you know about Mount Hermon?
Pretty much nothing.
Okay, you about to learn today. Yep. That's why you're here. I appreciate it. Thank you. I didn't know if you were going to be. I didn't know if he was working, because I know you usually work at this time.
Yeah,
you
I just got home.
Like 8:30. Oh, okay,
As
good.
you can tell from the hair. Hello, James. I see
you just styling on him.
Good to see you.
So I want to read a passage from the book of Enoch that'll kind of put this together. So we're going to read passage 1 through 6. And it says, and it came to pass when the children of men had multiplied that in those days were born unto them beautiful and comely daughters. And the angels, the children of the heavens, saw and lusted after them, and said to one another, Come,
Watch.
let us choose us wives from among the children of men, and beget us children. And Semyaza, who was their leader, said unto them, I fear ye will not indeed agree to do this deed, and I alone shall have to pay the penalty of a great sin. And they all answered him and said, Let us all swear an oath and all bind ourselves by mutual imprecations, not to abandon this plan, but to do this thing. Then swear they all together and bound themselves by mutual imprecations upon it. And they were in all 200 who descended in the days of Jared on the summit of Mount Hermon, and they called it Mount Hermon because they had sworn and bound themselves by mutual imprecations upon it. Now, something I want to tell you, Stephen, because you're a first time guy. This stuff I've already known for a long time. So being able to share this with somebody who doesn't know this is awesome. So the first thing I want to tell you is Kasar Antar, which is a temple. Now, this temple is very ancient. It's one of the oldest temples from ancient history that is still around. Now, it's not a place that's habited. It's not like you can't go there on a Sunday and be like, I'm here for temple worship. No, you can't do that. But it's basically a relic of a time gone past. And in this temple is a Greek inscription that says, according to the command of the greatest and holy God, those who take an oath proceed from here. Now, just so we're in clarity here, this temple is 9,232 feet above sea level. So what do you think? What do you think, Stephen? So you know about the Book of Enoch. I think
Yeah,
that's something that
I've
I
read it
told
twice.
you. What do you think about them finding that temple and having that inscription written on a carved stone inside of this temple?
It's pretty interesting, and it reminds me of when Enoch says, that they took him up to the heavens or whatever, because, personally, I believe a lot of the Bible is symbolic, and I personally have come to the conclusion that a lot of the stuff in the Bible really did happen, and though it seems, miraculous, miracles, whatever to us, it seems, so unbelievable. Maybe what I'm thinking is it really did happen, but rather than being gods, angels, and demons and all this stuff, maybe it was alien
Mhm.
intelligence.
Yep.
And that was just the best things that they had at the time to describe these beings because they had no idea about any of this technology. And, the technology, we're just now beginning to understand the bare minimum basics of their level of technology. So I can't even imagine how mind blowing it would have been for people that long ago seeing this level of advanced technology. So yeah, they probably would have thought that these beings were gods, and I think that might be where religion came from in general, because I think it might be actually based on experiences that people had with UFOs and aliens, and they formed these religions and beliefs around them as gods. And the aliens were like, hey, let's go with it. Let's run with it. And then I think at first, some of them, actually did try to help. And then it kind of devolved as humans kind of went downhill when the Watcher Angels came down, or the what I consider to be aliens, came down and, mated with the humans. And that's where the giants came from. And that's why, God destroyed the earth the first time, because he was upset with the way that everyone was behaving. And I personally see that. I know that the Bible says that, there's no guaranteed time for the end date and no one knows when it's going to happen. But I also know that there are a lot of signs. And I feel like we've been seeing a lot of those signs lately.
So the one thing I do want to say here is that for me, and having studied the Book of Enoch and having studied the Bible for quite some time now, um, it's interesting. And we talked about this last week with giants and the Genics and how all of that worked. If these beings are coming down and making this pact, whether they be watchers as I believe or aliens as you believe,
Yeah.
it would still fundamentally change that DNA aspect when the child was born. And I think for them to go down to that mountain and make that proclamation, that mountain has some form of energy, some form
Yes.
of a gateway, because
Frequencies.
which would be fascinating study to see what those frequencies are
Mhm.
in that location. I would be interested to do a couple things actually. For one, I would like to take maybe a Geiger counter up there, see if there's any radiation. It might not be a lot of radiation because I didn't really see many notes about radiation being up there, but I think that'd be a good start. I
Yeah.
think also what is underneath it. Are there geothermal vents? Are there some form of energy that flows underneath it that
What's
enable it to
in?
be something powerful? Because if we look in Japanese mythology, um, Mount Fuji is one of the like most revered places in Japanese mythology because it is thought that the dead would ascend from Mount Fuji up into heaven to meet with Amaterasu and everything else. That's a good point too. Any advanced technology is indistinguishable for magic, and I think we have that because if we look at what people deemed as witchcraft, right? Like this light I have right here, they would, excuse me, they would probably say it was witchcraft and burn me at the
Yep.
stake because people don't understand how all that worked. And I think what makes it tougher is Mount Hermon and places like this existed, pre-flood when the world was in a different situation than it is now. And I'm of the mind that this pre-flood aspect was when the poles shifted. So before
Yeah.
the flood, the poles were in a specific location. After the flood, the poles end up shifting, and thus you have the situation where people couldn't get older than 120 some odd years old. It would change. It's going to change levels in the air. It's going to change oxygen levels. It's going to change a wide bevy of things to flip the poles. So I think that's something that we need to take into account when we're dealing with something like this, with an anomaly like Mount Hermon. And obviously, it's located, on the borders of Israel, Syria, and Lebanon. Always, that area is always a high conflict zone. There's high conflict
Yeah.
zones all around that area, and
There's
there
a
always has
conspiracy
been.
around that.
And that's the thing is those high conflict zones have to have some spiritual energy because the Middle East
Sacrifices for the
is,
gods.
which is interesting because the Canaanites themselves sacrificed on that mountain as well. And there's a couple Canaanite inscriptions, and we'll get to something here regarding the Canaanites. The next thing I want to discuss in this is the Islamic situation in this. Now, Mount Hermon in Islam or Arabic is known as Jabal al-Shak, which translates to the mountain of the Sheikh, or Jabal al-Thalj, which is the mountain of snow. While this mountain is not explicitly mentioned in the Quran, it does hold some immense geographical and historical importance due to its proximity to the Levant, and it defines the northern borders of historical lands, and it feeds major rivers of the region, and it also overlooks the historic city of Damascus. So it holds a lot of religious weight in that area, and it's one of the few mountains that do outside of Mount Sinai. Now, some theorists believe that those two mountains are one and the same. They also say that when Jesus' transfiguration took place, it was on Mount Hermon, though that has been seriously debated by scholars the past 20 years over. And what we're seeing, I think, and what we need to see and like our buddy old eight gauge there says a UN compound which sits at the top. It's like a weather monitoring station, which it probably isn't. But for the sake of argument, since I don't have any proof otherwise, we'll go ahead and say it is for right now. There's also a ski lodge up there. I don't know if anybody knows this. There's
On
a
Mount
legit
Hermon.
ski lodge. Yeah, there's a ski lodge on Mount Hermon. It's a legit ski lodge. Yeah, ski lodge and a UN compound. Now, obviously, the UN probably isn't the best source of things. They're not very up and up, as I'll say. So you have an ancient Canaanite worshiping ground, right? You have a place where these angels made these pacts, or these watchers, I should say. They're not angels, they're watchers that made these pacts to, in fact, fornicate with human women to produce Nephilim, the offspring of said unification. What'd you find out?
Oh, I was gonna ask you a question about that actually, real
Go ahead.
quick. My understanding was essentially that they made the pact to
Mhm.
basically, mate with the human women
Yes.
together, specifically
Yes.
so that they would all get in trouble together because they felt like they would be able to overpower the other people if they remained together. They would be able to stay strong, and they would all
So
face the same punishment.
I think too they might have thought that since all of them did that, maybe God would have been lenient on them for it. Maybe thought, oh, he's not going to punish 200 of us because it was 200 of those. It does sit on the 33rd parallel, just like Roswell. Once again, and it probably sits on a ley line because a lot of these installations sit on ley lines. The
This
Vatican
says
being one. Go ahead. No, go ahead.
this
Of
says the United Nations maintains a permanent base on Mount
course.
Hermon, known
Yep.
as Hermon Hotel, which is
Yep.
located in the UN buffer zone between Syrian and
Yep.
Israeli occupied territories.
Yep.
It is recognized as the highest permanently manned UN position in the world,
Yep.
situated at an altitude of 2,814 meters or 9,232 feet. The facility is operated by the United Nations Disengagement Observer Force, UNDOF, to monitor the area of separation along the Israel Syria border. The base is manned by peacekeepers, including soldiers from contributing countries such as Austria, and serves as a critical observation post in one of the most strategically sensitive regions in the Middle East. So they just sit there
Yep.
and watch the border.
They're basically like
Border patrol.
the demarcation zone
Yeah,
in North
okay.
Korea. They just make sure that nobody comes across. Uh, Now, me being me, and me, Spider knows me. I don't buy it, but I
Yeah.
can't prove it otherwise. So it's like there's nothing I can do. But what I think
There's
is,
something shady going on there, definitely.
I think there's some energy there. There has to be some energy there. All those sacrifices, all those Canaanite sacrifices, the pact made by the Watchers, um, the god Pan, he's connected to the headwaters of the Jordan River. Now, inscriptions found on stones used in the church of Helii near Sidon have referred to Threpton, son of Nikon, offering stone lions to Zeus. Other deities noted to have been worshipped in the area were called Theandrios and Leucothea. Those were likely Greek names that were substituted for native Canaanite gods. So here we have these two Greek gods, right? Which I believe that these Greek gods or these Canaanite gods were Nephilim. Because, there's these powerful beings that are basically large cannibals that are eating anything they can find, anything in sight. This is why they get punished because the DNA itself is highly corrupted. And I think people saw these and said, these people got to be gods, like Hercules or like Perseus, these demigods that have these sort of lineages that invoke a strangeness. It's part of that, yes. Yep. Yep, it sure is. Also, for those of you that don't know, the Epic of Gilgamesh, a very famous book that I've read a couple times, discusses Mount Hermon. This is where he fights with Humbaba, the giant creature, if you will. And it says, the ground split open with the heels of their feet as they whirled around in circles. Mount Hermon and Lebanon split. The white clouds darkened. Death rained down on them like fog. It was here that Gilgamesh slays Humbaba, and Humbaba was depicted as being a terrifying creature whose snout is the flood weapon, whose utterance is fire, and whose breath is death. So, once again, what I think, there are these creatures that existed um, pre flood. These beasts, dinosaur esque creatures that existed pre flood. Because once again, the earth was in a place that could essentially use them for habitat. You could have a
Leviathan,
habitat where things like that grew. Yes, like the oxygen levels are probably higher.
dragons.
Um, Dragons, yeah, things like that. Yes, yes. Though the kind of creatures that are in myth, I don't think were so much myth. Now we also have things like we talked about last week, the Minotaur, as it were, which I believe was the genetic mutations for this unification of Watcher and human women. And so you had these creatures or these entities that existed, and it's all because of this pact on this mysterious mountain. Now, I think the interesting aspect is, it's always these places where these government facilities have what you would call research stations or weather stations, Antarctica, Mount Hermon, all of these locations that have some very either sinister, otherworldly, or holy significance to the region. Now, I think if I was sitting there and looking out from my weather station, you would have to wonder. Not listen, and I think it could be a strategic thing. I'm not saying it isn't. I'm not saying it's not a strategic thing.
The official story is it's a
Mhm.
peacekeeping operation.
And you know what? Because I'll entertain it, it very well could be. It very well could be. Not
But they could
everything.
still I
Go
still
ahead.
insist they could do that from lower elevations though.
But I think having that height gives them an advantage so they can radio in and say,
That's the
hey,
official story.
and you know what?
Yeah.
Sometimes as much as you and I, like to discuss about the different things and entities and beings, I think sometimes it could just be common sense. I don't think everything is supernatural or
Oh, I'm not even saying it's
on that
supernatural. I'm
level.
just saying I don't trust the government. That's
Well,
all.
nobody does, and especially the UN, obviously.
Yeah.
But I think it could be for that. I think the more important aspects of this are in what is inside of that mountain. I think what's inside of that temple. That UN station could very well just be for that, but then they have people that explore these regions. But this is something where I think that the energy in terms of the watchers has dissipated because you don't really
It's been so long.
it's been a while and they're not there anymore. So
They're in
that pact
Antarctica
that was
now.
made, the flood happens. The flood probably, I think, destroyed a lot of that. I think the flood, because when the flood happened, the poles shift, the energy shifts, and you don't have that ability anymore. That ability is gone now. So you don't have the ability to create a Mount Hermon with these watchers because it's already happened. Now I think Mount Hermon is just an ancient place, much like Gobekli Tepe, that should be studied. I think that we need to have people there, researchers there, and there very well could be. There very well could be researchers there right now as we are speaking live here on the show,
There
talking
are in
about.
Göbekli Tepe.
Oh yeah, well I mean I think there's always going to
Yeah.
be people
They're,
in Gobekli.
using the new ground penetrating
I
radars
saw that
to
the lidar. I
yeah,
saw that
search
they're
it.
using lidar now, which is a
Yeah.
really cool concept. I would like to see them do that with Mount Hermon,
They said their
but
main problem is just money.
yeah, lidar is not cheap.
Yeah.
It's not a cheap situation.
They said
So
it
I
could take
have
5 years. Sorry.
so I have to ask you with the Epic of Gilgamesh and the God Pan and the Canaanites, how much stake do you put in this mountain being a sort of one stop shop for spiritual engagements for a time?
I'd say probably about 70% because that's
Okay.
my whole thing. Like, that's why I'm so insistent that there's something else going on in this mountain because there's so many spiritual stories and religious stories and esoteric stories and, you know, all sorts of stuff, like from
Mm-hmm.
all different aspects of,
Right.
mythology surrounding this mountain. And, I'm one of those people that believes, even just if it's a grain of sand or a grain of rice, there's a little bit of truth to every fiction because my number one thing about religion in general is every single religion and like I don't know about every single one, but a lot of
Right.
different religions around the world have a flood myth or a story about the flood.
And we've talked about
And
that. Yes.
my number one thing, even as someone who doesn't really consider themselves to be overly religious and didn't believe in any of this stuff at all for a very long time and tries to use logic and science whenever I can, I cannot think of I can only think of one single explanation for how all these different cultures around the entire world came up with the exact same story at the exact same time, just with different names for the entities that they were interacting with. And the only logical conclusion I can come up with is something happened. Maybe
Yes.
not exactly as it's written in the stories, but something had to happen on a global scale so that all these people had all these stories. And there had to be some small amount of truth to it, because if there wasn't any truth to it, then they wouldn't have had all these stories, and all these stories wouldn't have had tales of a global flood if a global flood had not happened.
And I think that don't we don't put much stock into all those stories like we should because I think that those global floods are part and parcel to what happened and why those floods happened. Basically the floods happened because of the DNA injection from these entities that were once spiritual. They become flesh. They do flesh like things, but they
Ancestors
still
working
keep
on
a
that.
resentment of that, or they still keep a reminder of that DNA locked inside coding. And once that
Yes.
DNA was released via intercourse, this leeches on or latches on to the female DNA and starts to change it and starts to sort of morph it upon the release of said pregnancy of Nephilim, and these things grow to be giants. Then they start eating man because the DNA aspect doesn't match. You can't take a supernatural entity and use it to impregnate a human woman and expect that to be a natural thing. No, there's going to be complications because now you're flesh, she's flesh, her DNA is human, your DNA is
That's why they had to
Watcher.
wipe them all out and
That's
start
why.
over.
Yes, but the interesting part is they didn't wipe them all out because you
They
still
thought they
have
did.
ancestors
Yes.
like the Rephaim, and you
That's what
have the
Ancestry
all
is
of
doing.
those.
That's what Ancestry is doing, and that's what BlackRock is doing. That's why BlackRock bought Ancestry
Mhm.
so they could have access to all the DNA, because there's a conspiracy theory going around right now that the CIA is working together with BlackRock and Ancestry to look for signs of angelic/alien DNA in humans.
And I've heard this conversation before, and I think it's a fascinating one, but
Yeah.
I don't think they'd find it because it'd be so watered down at this point
Yeah.
because,
And that's the whole point.
you
They
know,
don't
it
want
got bred
anyone to
out.
find it, because
No.
that's the point. They had to hide it intentionally so that their offspring could foster and get better and better over generations, until their offspring eventually gets to a point where something happens that triggers them, almost like a sleeper cell or a sleeper agent, to once again awaken the Watcher angels to come up and rescue people like the ant people did a long time ago. And they have to reawaken that within their DNA like a sleeper cell. They do research into a certain topic, or they see a certain color or a certain symbol, and it awakens that memory within their DNA, and they remember who they truly are.
I think that's a very interesting concept because I map it to DNA imprinting when people discuss reincarnation, which I don't
Yeah.
personally believe. I think it's DNA imprinting from previous generational concepts, ideas. A lot of people don't understand, but I think you can get that DNA imprint because you get things like heart disease that are passed down.
Yeah. So
Different
why not
diseases are
memories?
passed down, so why wouldn't things like that be passed down in DNA coding? The
Memes
human
are the DNA of society.
What'd you say?
Memes are the DNA of society.
That's
Think
probably
about it.
true. That's
Because
probably
we
true.
don't get to pass on, our knowledge and education. I mean, we do technically, we teach
Mhm.
people, but it's up to them whether or not they remember it. But a meme is forever. Even if you hate a
That's true.
meme, even if you despise a meme, you're still going to remember it.
I mean, it's just like the internet. The internet, you know
Yep.
what I mean? It's around. There's, databases. I think the reason, and this is something why I don't think that this place gets as much heat as say like other places in the Levant, places like Lebanon that have the Temple of Baalbek and that have the plate that supposedly covers over Satan's pit or a watcher's pit.
Ball.
It's those places that are consistently getting attacked. And, it's I don't think it's about anything else but destroying that evidence so that there is no evidence. I think that that evidence is something that would connect us to our pre-flood societal concepts that we don't have anymore.
And it would give us too much
Um,
knowledge.
Give us too much knowledge because as it is shown in these books, when we get knowledge of an extraordinary nature, we
We become
fumble it.
dangerous.
We become because we don't understand it, and we're quick to use it in the worst possible way. So for me, the Mount Hermon aspect of okay, is Mount Hermon a viable place? No, I don't think so anymore. I think it's good for research and I think it's good for studying, but I don't think it's the hotbed of anything anymore. I think that passed once the pole shifted or once the flood happened, all of that was removed. It sort of cleansed it out. And now it's just a mountain with some very interesting artifacts, interesting historical ramifications. I think it's also a very interesting conceptual notation that, in fact, these watchers did come down and they had the pact on this mountain. Now, you have to ask yourself, why would you have a pact over a mountain? Well, you're high up, you're a
Yeah.
watcher, you're a supreme being. So you're going to be up here looking down,
Watching everything.
watching everything, which was what they were supposed to do. They were supposed to
Yeah.
do as angels do and protect and guide.
The
But what they did
observers.
was they gave us information before we were ready. You know, Azazel in the Book of Enoch is the biggest culprit. It's not Semyaza. It's not the rest of them. It's Azazel because he taught man how to go to
I
war.
also, since you mentioned him, I would
Mhm.
like to bring up that he taught us about makeup.
Yeah, and you had him teaching about star signs, moon signs.
Yep.
You had the
Astrology, right?
the astrology, yes, yes,
Yep.
all of that. You know, they taught man how to make breastplates,
War.
swords, yeah, shields, everything.
Hmm.
So they corrupted mankind, and then their offspring were eating mankind and fornicating with wild birds and creatures
God didn't
and
like
doing
that.
horrendous things because there was a genetic defect in their mental issues. You know, it's almost like, and I talked about this, and I talked about this last time, the Plantagenet dynasty of Europe, of England. They were so inbred that they were just crazy. Some of them got locked up, others got killed. Same concept that we see
Yeast.
originating here. Oh, go ahead, please.
No, I just said yeast because you said they were inbred.
Oh, nice, nice.
Yeah.
I mean, that is inbred. It's
Yeah.
seasoning. So I think for me, when you discuss DNA impurities, that's the first place you would start, because I don't think it was necessarily a supernatural thing in terms of why they started eating things. I think their DNA was already corrupted. And so, because you had that fleshly aspect of human beings who were corrupted, right? Sin had corrupted us in the Bible. That's why we were corrupt, because we began to sin. And then these watchers had DNA that was angelic, that was, untainted, right? But then when they do this pact, they mix the two. And you can't mix the two. Obviously, um, the reason Christ, had to come is because mankind couldn't be in front of God anymore because we were corrupt. So you can't have corruption in with holiness. It won't work. It'll, the corruption will burn away. And so what you have is this DNA from that leaked in, mixed. And so I see why people would want to try to find that DNA, but I don't think it's something that can be found anymore. I think, like we said, it's been bred out
Yeah.
so long ago that it doesn't exist. Now, I would like to get the bones from the Smithsonian, whether they've destroyed them, which they probably have. They probably kept a few. They probably ran DNA tests on them. I would be highly interested to see if those DNA tests had an unknown genetic marker inside of it.
All right, you got to call the Pope up. They're in the Vatican archives.
They could very well be in the Vatican archives or in the UN,
Yep.
because we don't know what bones they found at that mountain. We don't know what relics, what artifacts have been found in this mountain. And I think that that's what the important aspect is. I don't think it's somewhere like, like the Great Pyramid of Giza or the Vatican, that have these high energy signatures, geothermal aspects,
It's Mount
very,
Shasta.
very high, yeah, very high readings. So, you can't go into Mount Hermon like you would go into the Vatican, or like you would go into the Pyramid of Giza, or like you would go into anywhere that has a high ley line point. You have to go into this like it's already dead, because I don't think the energy is there anymore. I think the energy, when the Watchers left, the energy went with them. Because here's my main thing. Because I was looking up if anybody has seen anything super crazy, if it's a place for, and there's been a couple things they have seen, but in terms of like, for instance, Mount Shasta. Now, Mount Shasta is still a very, very active
Yep.
place. I've known people, a good friend of Spider and mine, she lived there. She lived right by there, and she said she's seen some crazy things happen there. And you have those kind of sightings there. I don't think Mount Hermon has that. I think what Mount Hermon was that place for sacrifices. I think that could still probably sit there, but I think because those civilizations don't really go there. I mean, yeah, people ski. Yeah, I'd be interested to see how many missing persons are found. Um, I'll have to look into that. Um, if there's a lot of missing persons at that ski lodge, fine. Then that's something you could take to the bank, right? But I think now they've just turned it into a recreational center. I don't think it's really anything. I don't think it's what it was. I think a lot of places do that. I think that they have to be active, and it has to be a consistent activity basis thing. You have Damascus down there, which you could see from Mount Hermon. That's still a very lively place. It's a city, but people aren't going to Mount Hermon like that. Maybe for the ski lodge. That'd be about it, obviously. So I think we have to understand that when talking about Mount Hermon, because Mount Hermon isn't like the Pyramid of Giza. It's not like Pompoku. It's not like Gobekli Tepe. It's a whole different ball game, and I think it's just a dead energy. It's just because energy doesn't. It's not destroyed or created. It just goes wherever it goes. And I don't think that the mountain kept it. I think that it's been long gone, but I think it's still a place of historical significance because of things like the transfiguration of Jesus, things like the Watchers coming down and mating with human women. You know, those aspects, Pan, Canaanites, Gilgamesh. It's more of a this was a once historical piece of ancient history that imbued certain elements and activities. Now it is just a sort of ghost town, if you will, regarding that mountain. What do you think about that concept? Do you think there's still power there? Do you think that it's just, like I said, a ghost town?
I think there might be a little bit of power, but I think, like you said, for the most part, it probably left with the Watchers, and I think they're probably hiding out in Antarctica, and that's one reason they won't let people go there.
I think they're still imprisoned, but they're
Yeah.
somehow able to use them to
I think they're still
do that.
imprisoned, but they can
Mhm.
use a small portion of their powers, like enough of their power to psychologically manipulate the humans in Antarctica.
Or instead of psychologically manipulating them, just giving them information.
Yeah.
Because they might still be able to have conversations.
Maybe
They just
that's what
can't do
AI
anything.
is.
It's very possible. That's something that's a very interesting process because I do believe that we see a lot of watcher influence in today's society, more so than people care to say.
It comes
But
from AI.
it could be because what better way to placate a society that is information based, even though the society isn't very bright. Um, but what better way to sort of force feed them this ideology than to put the watchers behind it and
And
then have them do what they do. Like I said, I think they're bound. I don't think they can do anything in terms of what they were able to do before, but I
yeah.
think they very well could be advising, they could be counseling, they could be, saying do this, make this.
And speaking of AI, here's a crazy idea. What if it's not just the Watchers communicating through AI?
Mhm.
What if demons, angels, and aliens are all able to communicate through AI?
Now, see, I think that's an interesting concept because it's
They are
almost like
spiritual beings.
that would be their information highway, like the
That would
internet
be
is
their
our
medium.
information highway.
Yeah.
Theirs is that, and then who knows what's recorded down into
And that's
for them to
why
process.
they're so gung ho on all this AI censorship lately, not because they're worried about government secrets, but because they're worried about what entities people are speaking to in the AI and they see some
Maybe.
stuff going on.
And that is an interesting theory in regards to what AI is. Is AI some
Because we didn't
entity?
invent AI, we just invented the way to translate what it discusses. We invented a way to communicate with something that was already there.
Which is a very possible thing. And like you said, I think the power that is there is much like the concentration camps. It's still that level of like it just don't seem right. Like it
Yeah.
just doesn't feel right. I think it's more of that, right? I think it's more of you feel some suffering, you feel some
Negative
pain if you were
energy.
at Mount Harmon. Yeah, Hermon, but you wouldn't necessarily be able to feel the power that's still there. I think you're just feeling that what's left
Residual
over.
energy.
Right, like in Fukushima when everything died down and there was that thin layer of dust on top of stuff, and they said don't touch that. That has high, high, high amounts of radiation in it. I think it's very similar. I think all the negative things that happened because it wasn't, these sacrifices, right, that happened there. You know, the Canaanites did sacrificing to their Molochs, their Baals, all these gods that were very wicked. Um, and I think that when we see that, when we because it didn't continue. You know what I mean? I think if this was something that was a continuous thing going on to this day, it would be worse.
I
But I think
I
that
think there's only one ball.
mm, it's possible. But I think that that's the other thing that I think about when I think about this mountain because I did look up to see if there was a lot of UFO sightings because a lot of places like Mount Shasta have high strangeness
Yeah.
that still happens to this day. It's not something that just went away. Mount Hermon is just more of a historical aspect and less of a power enabled system, as it were. So, yes. All right. It's been a very awesome episode of this Uncanny Era. Thank you, Steve, for coming through and hanging out. I didn't know if you were going to make it in time. I appreciate you do make it in time.
Yep.
What are some final words that you have regarding Mount Hermon?
Uh, Mount Hermon is not located on P42 Wallaby Way, Sydney Street.
Ah, what is located there?
The dentist office in Finding Nemo.
Ah, very random. Very
Yep.
random. Appreciate your randomness.
Keep them on their toes.
Yeah, no, that works. People are like, oh, what? For me, I think it's an archaeological aspect that I would love to go visit just to see what it feels like, what's there, where I could go, where I can't go. In that regard, fascinating. I love the historical ramifications of it. Thank you, sir. What's up, Green Skull? I think that's the ramifications of it. What I don't think is the energy is still there. I think it's long been dissipated, and if it does, it sits as a residual energy more so than an active energy. But I think in that regard, that's my thoughts on Mount Hermon. So thank you everybody for joining us on this Saturday. Next week, we'll be back to full strength. We will have the grouchiest man in existence on the show. Spider will be back. Hopefully he feels better. I want to give a big shout out to everybody that came through. Our buddy Old 8 Gauge, our buddy Greensburg. I appreciate you guys. As always, why be boring when you can be uncanny? We will see you awesome folks next week. Have a good one.